I had just returned home after being away on a month-long business trip. I was exhausted but excited to see my wife, Laura. Being away from her was always difficult, but we had managed through phone calls and video chats. At least that's what I thought. When I walked into the house, everything felt off. Laura greeted me at the door, but her hug was half-hearted. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she quickly excused herself to the kitchen. "Hey, I missed you," I said, following her. "Yeah, I missed you too," she replied, her tone flat as she grabbed a glass of water. I leaned against the counter, trying to brush off the weird vibe. "How was everything while I was gone?" "Fine. Just the usual," she said, avoiding eye contact. Her answers were short, her demeanor distant. This wasn't the warm, loving woman I had married. Something had changed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been changing for a while. That night, as we sat down for dinner, I tried to reconnect with her. "So, did anything exciting happen while I was away?" Laura shrugged. "Not really. Just worked on some projects, saw some friends." "What friends?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "You don't know them," she said quickly, her tone dismissive. "Just people I met through my book club." "Book club?" I didn't even know she had joined one. "When did you start going to a book club?" "While you were gone," she replied, her voice tight. "It's nothing serious. Just something to pass the time." The conversation felt strained, like I was grasping for something that wasn't there. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Laura was keeping something from me. I told myself I was imagining things, that the distance was just the result of my long trip. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Laura slept beside me, I couldn't ignore the nagging doubt creeping into my mind. Something wasn't right. In the days following my return, I tried to ignore the growing tension between Laura and me, convincing myself that it was just the result of being apart for so long. But the changes in her behavior were impossible to ignore. She spent more time on her phone, often turning the screen away when I walked into the room. She'd laugh softly at messages, her face lighting up in a way that I hadn't seen in months. "Who's so funny?" I asked one evening, trying to sound casual. "Just the book club group chat," she replied, locking her phone and setting it down screen side down. Her time at home also seemed limited. Laura used to love spending evenings curled up on the couch with me, watching TV or talking about our day. Now, she was always too busy. "I have a book club meeting tonight," she said one Thursday as she grabbed her coat. "Again?" I asked, frowning. "That's the third one this week." "Yeah, we're trying to finish a long novel," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Don't wait up." When Laura came home that night, I noticed a faint hint of cologne on her clothes. Not mine. "You smell different," I said as she set her purse down. She froze for a moment before laughing lightly. "Oh, one of the girls hugged me goodbye. She probably overdid it with her perfume." Her explanation sounded reasonable, but it didn't sit right with me. Laura wasn't the type to be careless with details, and something about her tone felt forced. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the events of the past few days in my mind. Laura's distance, her constant phone use, the unexplained cologne. It all pointed to something more than just post-trip awkwardness. For the first time, I started to wonder if Laura was hiding something from me. The changes in Laura's behavior weren't going away, they were growing. I found myself noticing more little things that didn't add up. She'd come home later than usual, her excuses vague and hurried. One Saturday, I suggested we spend the day together, just the two of us. Maybe a drive out to the countryside? We could grab lunch and talk. She hesitated, her expression awkward. "I can't. I already made plans with the book club." "On a Saturday?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah, we're meeting to discuss the next book. It's kind of a thing we do." She offered a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. After she left, I sat in the living room, staring at the spot on the couch where she used to curl up with me. The feeling of distance between us was no longer subtle, it was palpable. I decided to check our shared calendar, something we used to coordinate plans. There was no mention of a book club meeting. In fact, Laura hadn't added anything to the calendar in weeks. That evening, as we sat at the dinner table, I tried to probe gently. So, how's the book club going? I asked, cutting into my steak. Good, she replied, glancing up briefly before returning to her plate. What book are you reading now? Her fork paused midair, and she looked up, her expression caught off guard. The Nightingale. I nodded, storing the detail in the back of my mind. Later that night, I looked up the book. It wasn't a title she'd mentioned before, and it didn't seem like something she'd normally read. It was a small inconsistency, but it fed the growing doubts in my mind. That night, as Laura fell asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning. The woman I had loved and trusted for years felt like a stranger. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there had to be an explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I needed answers. The next morning, Laura left for her usual book club meeting. She kissed me on the cheek before walking out the door, her demeanor casual, but I couldn't shake the tension in the air. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee cup, debating what to do. The doubts in my mind were growing louder, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. If Laura wasn't going to tell me what was really going on, I needed to find out for myself. Later that day, I decided to take a closer look at her phone. Laura had always been open about sharing passwords. We used to joke about how we didn't have secrets, but recently, her phone had become off-limits. She rarely left it unattended and always kept it locked. My opportunity came when she left it charging in the living room while she went upstairs to grab something. My hands shook as I unlocked it using the password I knew from before. Her recent messages didn't show anything unusual. Most were short conversations with friends or work-related updates. But then I saw a thread with a name I didn't recognize. Mark. The thread wasn't long, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. Mark, can't wait to see you later. Laura, me too. Last time was so much fun. I locked the phone and set it back down, my heart pounding. Who was Mark? And why was Laura meeting him? When she came back downstairs, I tried to act normal, but I could feel the tension building inside me. Everything okay? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, I replied quickly, forcing a smile. Just tired. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, but I could tell she was watching me carefully. That night, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I couldn't stop replaying the messages in my mind. The words felt like a betrayal, even if I didn't have the full story yet. I decided that the next time Laura left for one of her meetings, I would follow her. I needed to know the truth. The next time Laura left for her book club, I decided to act. She told me she'd be gone for a few hours and kissed me goodbye like everything was normal. Don't wait up, she said with a smile. Have fun, I replied, forcing myself to sound casual. The moment the door closed behind her, I grabbed my keys and followed. I kept a safe distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I watched her car navigate through the streets. She didn't head toward the community center, where she'd said the book club usually met. Instead, she drove to a part of town I didn't recognize, eventually pulling into the parking lot of a small cafe. She parked her car and got out, checking her phone as she walked inside. I pulled into a spot across the street, my chest tightening as I waited. A few minutes later, a man walked into the cafe. I recognized him immediately. It was Mark from the texts. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried himself with a confidence that made my stomach churn. Laura greeted him at the door, her smile wide and genuine in a way I hadn't seen in months. They sat at a table near the window, leaning in close as they talked and laughed. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language said it all. The way she touched his arm, the way he leaned closer, it wasn't just friendly. I snapped a few photos with my phone, my hands shaking. They stayed at the cafe for nearly an hour before leaving together. I watched as they walked out to their cars, still chatting and smiling. Then Mark leaned in and hugged Laura. A hug that lasted just a little too long. She got into her car and drove away, leaving Mark standing in the parking lot. That night, when Laura came home, I tried to act normal, but my anger and heartbreak were barely contained. How was book club? I asked, keeping my tone even. Good, she said, slipping off her coat. "We're finishing up the book soon." Her lie felt like a slap in the face, but I didn't confront her. At least not yet. I needed more. The encounter at the cafe haunted me for days. Laura's laughter, her closeness with Mark, the way she lied so easily when she came home. It all replayed in my mind like a bad dream. I knew I couldn't let this go. I needed to uncover the full truth before confronting her. That weekend, while Laura was out running errands, I took the opportunity to search her laptop. It was risky, but I couldn't sit back any longer. At first, everything looked normal: emails from work, online shopping receipts, and the occasional forwarded meme from her friends. But then I found a folder buried deep in her files, titled simply Miscellaneous. Inside were several screenshots and messages between Laura and Mark. They weren't explicit, but they were far too personal to be platonic. "Mark, thinking about you. When can we meet again?" Laura, "Soon, I hope. I miss you." One screenshot was a reservation confirmation for a restaurant on a date, when Laura had told me she was working late. My stomach churned as I read the details, the pieces of her deception falling into place. That evening, as Laura sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, I tried to act casual. "So, when's the next book club meeting?" I asked, my tone light. She didn't look up. "Tuesday," she said without hesitation. "Oh? What book are you reading again?" "The Nightingale," she replied, her answer coming just a little too quickly. I nodded, storing the detail for later. Her lies were unraveling, and I was determined to catch her in the act. The next day, I decided to install a GPS tracker on her car. It felt invasive, but I needed to know where she was going during her meetings. That evening, as she slept, I placed the small device under her bumper, my heart pounding with every sound in the quiet night. I told myself it was the only way to confirm what I already suspected. Over the next few days, I monitored the GPS tracker on Laura's car. Most of her stops were ordinary grocery stores, her favorite coffee shop, and the gym. But on Tuesday evening, when she claimed she was heading to her book club, the tracker pinged a location I didn't expect. It wasn't the community center or any place associated with a book club. Instead, her car stopped at a small boutique hotel across town. My chest tightened as I stared at the app on my phone. There was no mistaking it. Laura was somewhere she shouldn't have been. I waited, watching the tracker for over an hour. Her car didn't move. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, the truth sinking in deeper and deeper. When she finally left, her car headed straight home. That night, Laura walked through the door, greeting me with her usual smile. "How was book club?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Good," she replied, slipping off her shoes. "We had a great discussion about the book." Her lie hit me like a slap in the face, but I kept my emotions in check. I couldn't confront her yet. I needed more proof. The next day, I drove to the boutique hotel during my lunch break. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as I walked in. "Hi, I'm trying to confirm a reservation for Laura," I said, keeping my tone casual. The clerk checked the computer. "Laura? Let me see. Oh yes, she had a room booked yesterday evening." My stomach dropped. "Was she alone?" I asked, bracing myself. The clerk hesitated, then shrugged. "I'm not sure. Sorry." I thanked the clerk and left, my mind racing. I now had confirmation that Laura had been at the hotel, but I needed to know who she was with. That evening, I reviewed the photos I had taken at the cafe and the screenshots from her laptop. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same person, Mark. As I sat on the couch, my phone buzzing with another ping from the tracker, I knew it was time. The next time Laura went out, I would follow her and see the truth for myself. When Laura told me she had another book club meeting that Thursday, I nodded, feigning indifference. "Have fun," I said, hiding the storm brewing inside me. "Thanks," she replied with a quick smile, grabbing her bag and heading out the door. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my keys and followed at a safe distance. The GPS tracker had already confirmed where she was going, but I needed to see it for myself. She drove across town, taking familiar turns until she reached the boutique hotel. My stomach churned as I watched her park, get out of the car, and walk toward the entrance with purpose. A few minutes later, Mark appeared. He pulled into the lot, stepping out of his car with the same confident air I'd seen at the cafe. Laura greeted him at the entrance, her smile brighter than anything I'd seen from her in months. They didn't hug, but the way they stood close, leaning into each other, made it clear this wasn't just a friendly meeting. I stayed in my car, watching as they disappeared into the hotel lobby together. My chest felt tight, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they ached. This was it, the confirmation I'd been dreading but knew was coming. After about 20 minutes of sitting there, staring at the hotel doors, I snapped a few photos of their cars parked side by side. Then, without thinking, I got out of my car and walked into the lobby. The clerk at the desk looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "I'm looking for Laura. She just checked in." The clerk frowned, glancing at the guest registry. "I'm sorry, sir. We can't share that information." I nodded, clenching my jaw. "Thanks anyway," I said, turning to leave. Back in the car, I sat in silence, trying to process what I'd seen. Laura wasn't just growing distant. She was living an entirely different life behind my back. By the time she came home that night, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to sit on this any longer. The confrontation was coming. The next evening, after dinner, I decided it was time to confront Laura. I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal when I knew the truth. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm about to hit. "Laura," I said, my voice steady but firm. She looked up, her expression cautious. "Yeah, we need to talk." She sat up, setting her phone down. "What's going on?" I walked over to the coffee table, placing my phone in front of her. The photos I'd taken of her and Mark at the cafe and the hotel were on the screen. "Care to explain this?" I asked, my tone cold. Her eyes widened as she looked at the images, her face draining of color. "Mike, don't lie to me," I interrupted, my voice rising. "I know you've been meeting him. I know about the hotel, the texts, everything." Laura's hands trembled as she picked up the phone, staring at the evidence. "I can explain," she said, her voice shaking. "Go ahead," I said, crossing my arms.
"I'm listening."
She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Finally, she broke down, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she choked out. "That's not an explanation," I said bitterly. "Who is he, Laura? How long has this been going on?" "His name is Mark," she admitted quietly. "I met him a few months ago, at the gym." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. "At the gym? So, all these book club meetings were just an excuse to see him?" She nodded, her sobs growing louder. "It wasn't supposed to be like this, Mike. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did," I said, my voice cold. "You lied to me, Laura. You betrayed me." For a moment, the room was silent except for her quiet sobs. I paced the room, my thoughts racing. Finally, I stopped and looked at her. "You need to leave," I said firmly. Her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filled with panic. "Mike, please don't do this. I'll end it with him. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." "It's too late for that," I replied. "You made your choice, Laura. Now you have to live with it." She broke down completely, but I didn't waver. Her betrayal had shattered our marriage, and there was no going back. Laura sat on the couch, her sobs filling the room. For a moment, I felt a pang of something, sadness, maybe even pity, but it was quickly drowned out by the anger and betrayal coursing through me. "You need to leave," I said again, my voice firmer this time. Her shoulders shook as she looked up at me, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Where am I supposed to go?" she whispered. "That's not my problem," I replied coldly. "You can stay with him, Mark, or whatever his name is. You clearly had no issue finding your way to him before." She flinched at my words, her tears flowing harder. "Mike, please, don't do this. I love you. I never stopped loving you." "Love," I snapped, the bitterness in my voice cutting through the air. You call this love? Lying to my face, sneaking around, cheating with another man? That's not love, Laura. That's betrayal. She shook her head, her hands trembling. I made a mistake, she said, her voice breaking. A terrible mistake, but it doesn't mean I don't love you. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. A mistake? A mistake is forgetting our anniversary, or saying something you didn't mean in an argument. What you did, Laura, wasn't a mistake. It was a choice you made over and over again. The weight of her actions hung heavy between us, filling the room with an unbearable silence. I'll pack a bag, she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. I nodded, watching as she stood and walked upstairs. The sound of her footsteps on the stairs felt like the closing of a door, a final nail in the coffin of our marriage. When she came back down with a small suitcase, she hesitated by the door, looking at me with tear-filled eyes. I'm sorry, Mike, she said softly. I'll regret this for the rest of my life. I didn't respond. Couldn't. She opened the door and stepped outside, the sound of it clicking shut behind her echoing through the house. That night, the silence was suffocating. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photos on my phone. The life I thought I had was gone, replaced by a painful reality I couldn't escape. Laura was gone, and for the first time I was truly alone. The first night without Laura felt endless. The house, once filled with laughter and conversation, was now unbearably quiet. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty couch where she used to sit, my thoughts a swirling mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. The next morning, I decided to take the first step toward moving forward. I gathered her things, her clothes, her books, even the coffee mug she always used, and packed them into boxes. It wasn't about erasing her. It was about reclaiming my space. As I placed the last box by the door, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Laura. I'm sorry, Mike. I know I've ruined everything, but I'll always love you. I stared at the screen for a long time before locking my phone without replying. Her words felt hollow now, like a band-aid on a wound too deep to heal. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work. It was a welcome distraction, something to keep my mind off the wreckage of my marriage. My coworkers noticed the change in me, my quiet demeanor, my lack of focus, but I wasn't ready to talk about it. Greg, my closest friend at work, pulled me aside one afternoon. You okay, man? He asked, his tone gentle. I hesitated before nodding. Just going through some stuff. If you ever need to talk, I'm here, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Thanks, I replied, grateful for his support, even if I wasn't ready to open up yet. That weekend, I decided to make some changes around the house. I rearranged the furniture, painted the bedroom walls a calming shade of gray, and replaced the photos of Laura and me with pictures of my family and friends. Each change, no matter how small, felt like a step toward reclaiming my life. That night, as I sat on the back porch with a drink in hand, I reflected on how much had changed. Laura's betrayal had shattered everything I thought I knew, but it hadn't destroyed me. I wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, I felt a spark of hope. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, the weight of Laura's betrayal began to lift. It wasn't gone completely. There were still moments when the memories crept back, sharp and painful, but they no longer controlled me. One evening, Greg invited me out for a drink. Come on, he said. You've been cooped up in that house too long. You need to get out. I hesitated but eventually agreed. At the bar, Greg and I sat in a corner booth, catching up on work gossip and talking about life. Felt good to laugh again, to feel normal, even if just for a little while. As the night went on, a few of Greg's friends joined us. One of them, a woman named Rachel, introduced herself with a warm smile. You're Mike, right? She asked, sliding into the seat across from me. Yeah, I replied, shaking her hand. Nice to meet you. She was easy to talk to. Funny, sharp, and down to earth. It wasn't romantic, but it was refreshing to connect with someone new. The next day, I felt lighter, like I'd taken another step toward rebuilding my life. Inspired by the outing, I started saying yes to more invitations, dinners with friends, hiking trips, even a painting class I'd always been curious about. These small experiences reminded me that there was a world outside of my pain, a world I could still enjoy. One Saturday, I decided to visit the park where Laura and I used to go for picnics. It was a place I had avoided since the separation, but something drew me back. As I sat on a bench overlooking the lake, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The betrayal still hurt, but it no longer defined me. That night, as I sat on the porch watching the stars, I realized something important. I was rediscovering who I was outside of my marriage. Laura's actions had shattered our life together, but they had also forced me to confront parts of myself I'd been neglecting. I wasn't the same person I was before, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. As the weeks passed, life began to feel more like my own. Each day brought a small victory, whether it was laughing at a joke with Greg, finishing a project at work, or trying something new on the weekends. One Saturday, Greg invited me to a barbecue at his place. "It's low-key," he said. "Just some friends, good food, and a chance for you to relax." I hesitated but eventually agreed. The backyard was buzzing with laughter and conversation when I arrived. Greg handed me a beer, and we fell into easy chatter with a group of his friends. That's when I met Claire. She was a friend of Greg's wife, standing near the grill with a plate in hand. Greg introduced us, and we struck up a conversation. "Mike, huh?" she said, smiling. "Greg's mentioned you. Says you're a workaholic." "Guilty," I replied with a laugh. She had an easygoing demeanor and a sharp sense of humor that made the conversation flow effortlessly. By the end of the evening, we'd exchanged numbers, not for anything serious, but simply to keep in touch. Over the next few weeks, Claire and I began texting casually. It started with recommendations for books and places to eat, then evolved into longer conversations about life, work, and everything in between. For the first time since Laura's betrayal, I felt a connection that wasn't weighed down by the past. One afternoon, Claire suggested meeting for coffee. "No pressure," she said. "Just a chance to hang out in person again." I agreed, and when we met at a small cafe downtown, the conversation flowed as easily as it had at the barbecue. We talked for hours, laughing about everything from awkward childhood stories to terrible first jobs. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet, but it felt good. That evening, as I sat on the porch with a drink in hand, I reflected on how far I'd come. The pain of Laura's betrayal still lingered, but it was no longer the defining chapter of my life. There were new opportunities, new connections, and new reasons to hope. My conversations with Claire became a regular part of my life, something I looked forward to. We weren't rushing into anything. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people enjoying each other's company. One evening, she invited me to join her for a charity event she was helping organize. "It's nothing fancy," she said, "just a fundraiser at the local community center. But it's for a good cause." I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to step into her world, but I eventually agreed. The event was small but lively, filled with people chatting, laughing, and bidding on silent auction items. Claire introduced me to her friends, and I found myself relaxing in the easy atmosphere. "You're good at this?" I told her as she worked the room, making everyone feel welcome. She smiled. "I just like bringing people together." Her warmth and sincerity were contagious, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope, not just for a potential relationship, but for the possibility of trusting someone again. After the event, Claire and I grabbed coffee at a nearby diner. We talked late into the night, sharing stories about our lives and the challenges we'd faced. "You've been through a lot," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. "But it seems like you're finding your way." "I'm trying," I admitted. "It's not easy, but I think I'm getting there." She smiled, her expression encouraging. "You're stronger than you think, Mike." That night, as I drove home, her words stayed with me. Trusting someone new after what I'd been through wasn't easy, but Claire's kindness and patience made it feel possible. Back at home, I sat on the porch, staring up at the stars. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm, a belief that things could get better. Laura's betrayal had broken something in me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was healing piece by piece. Months had passed since Laura left, and my life felt entirely different. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when the memories of her betrayal resurfaced, but they no longer had power over me. The house that once felt like a hollow reminder of what I'd lost was now filled with new energy. I'd redecorated, moved furniture, and created a space that felt like my own. Every change was a step toward reclaiming my life. My connection with Claire had grown deeper. What started as casual coffee meetups turned into long hikes, late-night conversations, and eventually a quiet realization. I trusted her. One evening, as we walked along the lake near my house, Claire turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what's next for you?" she asked softly. I paused, considering her question. "I do," I said, nodding. "And for the first time in a long time, I'm excited about it." Her smile was warm, reassuring. "Good. You deserve that." That night, as I sat on the porch, I thought about how far I'd come. Laura's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also forced me to reevaluate my life and my priorities. I realized that what I missed wasn't Laura herself. It was the idea of what we were supposed to have. But that idea had been built on lies, and now I had the chance to build something real. Claire wasn't a replacement for Laura. She was something entirely new, a reminder that life could move forward, even after heartbreak. As I sat there watching the stars, I felt a quiet sense of peace. The past was a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And the future? For the first time, it felt wide open. In the months that followed, my life began to settle into a new normal, a better one. The routines I once dreaded became something I looked forward to. I woke up early to cook breakfast, something I'd neglected for years, and started taking time to enjoy the little things. Morning runs, weekend drives, and afternoons at the park. Claire and I continued to grow closer. It wasn't rushed or forced. It was natural. She encouraged me to revisit old hobbies, and with her gentle nudging, I started woodworking again, a passion I'd put aside after getting married to Laura. One weekend, I built a coffee table for the living room. It wasn't perfect. The edges were a little uneven, and the stain was darker than I intended, but it felt like an accomplishment. "You made this?" Claire asked, running her hand over the wood when she came over to see it. "Yeah," I said, feeling a little embarrassed. "It's not great, but it's amazing," she interrupted, smiling. "You should make more." Her support gave me the confidence to keep going. I started taking on small projects for friends, and before I knew it, I was filling orders for custom furniture. What began as a way to pass the time became a side business I genuinely enjoyed. Through it all, Claire remained a steady presence in my life. She wasn't just a partner. She was a friend, someone who reminded me that I didn't have to face life's challenges alone. A year after Laura left, I found myself standing in the park where Claire and I often walked. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and I felt a sense of gratitude I hadn't experienced in years. Life hadn't gone the way I planned. The betrayal, the heartbreak, and the rebuilding, it was all unexpected. But standing there, watching Claire laugh as she tossed a frisbee to her dog, I realized that life had a way of surprising you in the best ways. 2. The woodworking business continued to grow. I even started teaching a beginner's class at the community center, sharing the craft with people looking for their own fresh start. It wasn't just about the work. It was about the connections, the stories, and the way we all supported each other. One evening, after one of my classes, Claire and I sat on the porch with mugs of tea. The quiet between us was comfortable, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. "I'm proud of you," she said, breaking the stillness. "For what?" I asked, smiling. "For rebuilding," she replied. "For finding joy again." Her words stuck with me. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about everything I'd been through. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be. But it was mine, and it was filled with possibility. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just looking back at what I'd lost. I was looking ahead, and the future was bright. If you like our content, Leave a like and subscribe for more videos.